At the end of chapter 1, Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem, and the women and the people were saying, "Is that Naomi?" And Naomi said, "Don't call me Naomi. In other words, don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara, bitter, because the Lord has acted bitterly to me." She didn't see that they just happened to arrive at the beginning of the barley harvest, which would be followed by the wheat harvest. Well, now in chapter 2, we're going to see how God, again, behind the scenes, is orchestrating things to lead to the resolution of this great family problem, the death of Naomi's husband and her 2 sons, but how, as we'll see at the end of the book, our lives are not limited to ourselves and our families and our own problems. Naomi, Boaz, Ruth, none of the people in this story would have realized that this little family tragedy was, and this famine, and everything that happened was an integral part of God's overall plan, ultimately, that leads to King David and ultimately to the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So, chapter 2 really falls into 3 parts. First, verses 1 through 7. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man, who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Now, we've already talked about the fact that how the author of the book of Ruth is a master storyteller and literary stylist. We talked about his use of chiasm throughout the book. Well, the depth and subtlety of his literary style is seen in that while all of chapter 2 is itself chiastic, and I make that clear in the outline in the our written book on Ruth, the author again employs chiasm within chiasm, and therefore, as I point out in the book in written form, verses 1 through 3 here in chapter 2 are themselves chiastic. And it goes, A, B, C, D, and then C prime, B prime, A prime. And now, verses 1 through 7 set the stage for the actual meeting of Ruth and Boaz. And these verses introduce us to Boaz and tell us a number of important things about him. First, he was a relative of Naomi's dead husband Elimelech, and from the same clan as Elimelech. Now, that is a crucial fact for the rest of the story. Second, verse 1 describes him as a worthy man. Now, the Hebrew phrase is Gibor Hayil. It indicates one who possesses social standing and a good reputation. In this context, it connotes wealth and status, but also ability, honor, and capability. So it's clearly a description of his character, similar to how the fact in Proverbs 31, it describes a woman of strength of character, an Eseth Hayil, and Ruth is described as an Eseth Hayil. Here, Boaz is a man of honor, a worthy man, a Gibor Hayil. Now, these verses 1 through 7 also give us further insight concerning the character of Ruth. We've already seen Ruth's devotion to Naomi and her manifestation of Hesed by clinging to her and going with her, leaving her own people, her own country, hanging on to and going with Naomi to Bethlehem and becoming devoted to and a follower of Yahweh. Well, now we see that it is Ruth who takes the initiative to glean in the fields in order to care for her mother-in-law and herself. And now, gleaning had been ordered by God as a means of taking care of widows, orphans, and foreigners in Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 24. But notice something. In this begins here. Ruth is the one who says in verse 2, "Let me go to the field and glean." Naomi is so bitter, depressed, and so on. Naomi is basically passive at this point. It's Ruth who takes the initiative. And second, we see that she's humble. She did not just start out gleaning, even though that was her right under the law, but she asked, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." She asked the man in charge. Third, we see that she is industrious and diligent. Boaz's reapers reported to him that she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. In doing this, Ruth was exhibiting the character traits that should characterize all Christians. God has created us to work that is good and honorable, and it should be done to honor God. A lot of people think that work is part of the curse that happened when people fell into sin. That's not true at all. Work was ordained before the fall into sin. In Genesis 2, God told Adam to, work and keep, preserve, protect the garden, cultivate it and keep it, and so on. And so that was before the fall. So work is built into our nature, and the New Testament certainly tells us explicitly time and time again, and I have multiple scriptures listed here in the book on Ruth on this. It calls on people not to be lazy or slothful, but to be diligent workers. That's the way to raise ourselves up and to prosper. And it's through working and engaging in business that God gives us the ability to make wealth and better ourselves. Paul exhorts believers regarding work in 2 Thessalonians 3, where he says, "Now we command you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you keep away from any brother who is walking in idleness and not in accord with the tradition that you received from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to imitate us, because we were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with toil and labor we worked day and night, that we might not be a burden to any of you. It was not because we do not have that right, but to give you in ourselves an example to imitate. For even when we were with you, we would give you this command: if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. For we hear that some among you walk in idleness, not busy at work, but busy bodies. Now such persons we command and encourage in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and to earn their own living." In other words, what Paul is saying is that work is not only a financial necessity, but it is a moral imperative. Work is contrasted with the moral sin of sloth or idleness, and it is also contrasted with the sin of being a meddlesome person who loves to pry into the lives of others rather than minding his or her own business. In other words, being a busybody. Now, and so again, in our churches, we need to talk about this, the value of work, preach upon it, and I think help people who need work to get it. I know a pastor friend of mine in central Kenya. He has a good reputation in town, and he has helped many people get jobs because he's gotten to know the owners of petrol stations, of restaurants, of hotels, and so on. And so that if somebody comes and needs a job, he can call up one of these people and say, listen, I've got this young man or this young woman. They need a job. Can you offer them a job? And he's been able to place many people because the people in town know him. He has a good reputation, and I'm sure he tells the person, listen, I can get you this job because I know this person. But you need to know, my name is on the line here as much as yours. You need to be the best employee that employer has. Show up to work on time, work hard, don't steal from him, don't talk against him, be an example. Because, I mean, the Bible talks a lot about this. And so you who are in church leadership, you need to know your people, because you have people with needs, financial needs, but you also have resources, business people who might be able to offer jobs, people who need a house girl or something like that. So work is a moral imperative as well as a financial necessity. Now, these verses here are also telling us that God is sovereignly carrying out his plan behind the scenes. He was aware, God was, of all the aspects of Boaz and Ruth, and Naomi would have known the nature and character of Boaz and Ruth, and yet, because of her blindness and depression, she could not see these things. And this should remind us that when we are going through extremely difficult circumstances, there's far more to our situation than we may be able to see or that we may choose to see. And we see this here in verse 3, where it says, Ruth happened to come to that part of the field belonging to Boaz. Now, the Hebrew literally says, her chance chanced. Now, the author is using a hyperbole, an obvious intentional exaggeration, to highlight the fact that it is not by chance, but by God who is controlling the situation. Ronald Hales puts it like this: the labeling of Ruth's meeting with Boaz as a chance is nothing more than the author's way of saying that no human intent was involved. For Ruth and Boaz, it was an accident, but not for God. By calling the meeting an accident, the writer enables himself subtly to point out that even the accidents of our lives are directed by God. And then in verse 4, it goes on to express a similar thought when it says, and behold, Boaz showed up. Specifically, it says, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. What it's saying is, wouldn't you know it, Boaz just happened to show up at that same time. This is telling us that our lives do not take place by chance. Even in the worst of circumstances, God is still sovereign and he's carrying out his plan. Now, the next aspect of chapter 2 is verses 8 through 16, the actual meeting of Boaz and Ruth. Verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. At the mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here, and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed her the roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some of the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. Now, when Boaz refers in verse 8 to Ruth as my daughter, that indicates there was probably a substantial age difference between the two of them. The reapers calling her the young Moabite woman, and Boaz later saying in chapter 3, you've not gone after the young men, also indicate that there was probably a fairly substantial age difference between Boaz and Ruth. But verses 11 and 12 reveal that Boaz had been made aware of all that Ruth had done for Naomi and how she'd left her native land and come to Bethlehem. And Boaz's nature as a godly man is confirmed where he says, the Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge. Now, after he received the report concerning who Ruth was, Boaz confers extraordinary support and privileges to Ruth. And some have concluded, Kalos and Younger, for example, who happened to be my Hebrew professor and has written a commentary on Judges and Ruth, believes that Ruth had probably been the subject of some sexual harassment and was about to leave when Boaz showed up. And that might, if that's true, it might explain why Boaz said, number one, remain in this field. Don't go to somebody else's. Stay close with my women reapers. And he specifically told the young men, don't touch her or molest her. And if she's thirsty, she may drink from the water that the young men had drawn for the other regular employees. And he went even beyond that. In verse 15, he said, you can glean among the sheaves. And in verse 16, he said, and he told the male reapers, even pull out from some of the bundles for her and leave it for her to glean and don't rebuke her. Now, these provisions went far beyond the normal rites of gleaning. In Leviticus 19, verse 9, it only permitted the needy and foreigners to glean along the edges of a field. Well, Boaz is permitting Ruth to glean with the regular reapers where the harvest is much better, namely in the middle of the field. So he was demonstrating in this that he had taken God's concern for the poor to heart. In Deuteronomy 15, it says, if among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother, but open your hand to him. Lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. You shall give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him. That's exactly the character that Boaz demonstrated to Ruth, indicating he was a man of God on the inside as well as on the outside. It was not just his words, but his actions demonstrated that he had God's heart. Now, sexual harassment was not a category of behavior recognized by Israelite law. But when Boaz told his men not to touch her or speak improperly to her, he was going beyond what most employers in that time and place and culture did. And normally, it would be the foreigners who'd draw the water and women who would draw the water. But here it's the men who drew the water, and a foreigner was given the privilege to drink from it. Boaz went even farther in verse 14 when he had Ruth share the midday meal with him and provided her with more than she could eat. In other words, leftovers that she could take back to Naomi. You see, gleaners typically would not be invited to join the regular employees and reapers in the midday meal. In all of these things, Boaz is demonstrating chesed to Ruth. And it's important for us to notice something. His demonstrating chesed to Ruth and Ruth's demonstrating chesed to Naomi do not take place in some religious setting, but take place in the daily workplace where chesed is often sadly lacking. This, again, should serve as a role model for us. Now, Ruth's reaction to all of this in verse 10 shows how completely surprised and overwhelmed she is by the grace Boaz has shown her. And but Boaz explains that everything that you've done for your mother-in-law, I have been made aware of. And he echoes, and he said, how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. Again, we see the subtlety of the author of Ruth, because those words echo what God had told Abram when he told Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to a land that I will show you. Pardon me. This is a veiled hint that Ruth is playing a significant part in salvation history, even though neither Boaz nor Ruth could possibly have known that themselves. There are other parallels. Robert Alter, I mentioned him in the introduction, says Ruth is being conceived by the author as a kind of matriarch by adoption. And there are other parallels. Both Abram and Ruth began their lives as pagans. They both traveled from their homes that were located east of Israel to the west, to Israel. And the same is true of the matriarchs Rebekah, Isaac's wife, and Rachel and Leah, Jacob's wives. They were all from Mesopotamia, east of the Euphrates, and they, like Abram, were natives of a foreign country east of Israel. Now, in Genesis, considerable importance is attached to ascertaining the genealogy of the potential wife for Isaac and Jacob. But here in Ruth, Boaz is saying that Ruth's courage, her loyalty, and her character to her mother-in-law amply take the place of her genealogical background. And when Boaz says in verse 12, the Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward be given you from the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge, he's in effect saying, the Lord is the one repaying you for what you have done, and I am simply his instrument of blessing. And that God is rewarding and will reward Ruth because she has sought shelter under God's wings. Sheltering under God's wings is a rich metaphor, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, that speaks of God's faithful protection, his healing, strength, and joy. And now this is a phrase that is going to recur in chapter 3, and we will discuss it in more detail there. Now, remember, Ruth had said in verse 2 that let me go into the field and glean after him in whose sight I shall find favor. Well, now, in verse 13, Ruth's statement, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, shows that her request to glean in the field of one in whose sight I find favor has now been answered. Now, the last section is verses 17 through 23, which says this. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied, in other words, from the midday meal. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they've finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and the wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Now, the excellence of the author as a literary stylist is again seen in that verses 17 through 23 themselves are chiastic, this inverted structure. And I point that out here in the book. And so now an ephah of barley has been estimated at about a half to maybe 2/3 of a bushel, or 10 to 20 liters. An ordinary gleaner could never have acquired that amount. But the fact that Boaz told her work with the regular gleaners and the regular reapers means that she continued until the barley and wheat harvests were over, which typically lasted about 7 weeks. If she continued to reap a similar amount, she would have had enough grain to feed herself and Naomi for 8 to maybe 12 full months. And the key fact that is revealed here is that Boaz is described in verse 20 as a close relative, one of our redeemers. Now, what Naomi is referring to is the institution of the Israelite institution of the kinsman-redeemer, or in Hebrew, a goel, who was the nearest adult male blood relative who served as an advocate for any vulnerable or unfortunate clan member to correct disruption to clan wholeness, well-being, especially through the redemption or restoration of property, persons, or lineage. One aspect of this is that if a clan member died without leaving children, he could marry the widow, and the firstborn son would assume the name of the deceased husband. So in other words, a kinsman redeemer, Elimelech had died without leaving any his sons died, so there was no one who could inherit. This is often called levirate marriage, from the Latin word levir, which means a husband's brother. Now, the brother could be a biological sibling or of the deceased, or a person who is socially classified as such. And the key thing is restoration of inheritance and of property. So, as Lawson Younger points out, when the land has been alienated, as Elimelech did here, its redemption of the land triggers the levirate duty of levirate marriage. Now, it will prove crucial. This will prove crucial in Boaz's later interaction with a nearer kinsman, because there was somebody who was closer in line to be a kinsman redeemer than Boaz was. This is going to be played out in chapters 3 and particularly chapter 4. Now, Younger adds that the goel was not legally obligated to perform the function of redemption, but there was a moral choice involved. He had the choice to do so. Therefore, he had to be willing to do so. Now, verse 23 takes us to the end of the barley and the wheat harvests. Now, this underscores the fact that Ruth has been diligently laboring for approximately 2 months, perhaps being able to glean an ephah a day. But there's no indication in the text that the Boaz-Ruth relationship has gone anywhere. In short, from the storytelling point of view, we're left in suspense. So again, we are in the hands of a master storyteller, and he's telling us good things, but then leaving us in suspense. So what's going to happen next? Well, we'll find out in chapter 3.